From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
How many of you saw the Flutter Live event held in London on the 4th of December 2018? Google announced Flutter 1.0. We've talked about how awesome it could be building apps with Flutter, but at the same event, a startup in Estonia partnered with Google to announce a brand new CI and delivery service tool called CodeMagic. This startup is Nevercode, and Nevercode built CodeMagic. Today, I'd like to thank them for sponsoring this show. CodeMagic is the first CI/CD tool created exclusively for building Flutter applications. The idea for them was, without any deep technical knowledge, app developers like us should be able to easily configure the whole flow for the Flutter platform to the users of our app on the Play Store or App Store. Because remember, with Flutter apps, you can easily build both Android and iOS applications. It's a cloud-based CI/CD tool for building, testing, and publishing Flutter apps. Users log in via GitHub and select the repository containing their Flutter application, after which they can immediately start a build with pre-configured defaults. Even the folks at Google working on Flutter have had great things to say about this. For example, Tim, the group PM for Flutter, said this: Nevercode has a really good understanding of the workflow that Flutter developers want. Their CodeMagic product takes all the pain out of the build process. That's pretty cool. So if you're a Flutter dev, build, test, and publish your Flutter apps in record time with CodeMagic. Go ahead and check them out at codemagic.io. But here's the kicker. For the time being, the tool is available to everyone at no cost because they just announced it. It's totally free, but in the future, it probably will include paid options in addition to the free plan. So you should check them out while they're still hot from the presses. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Nevercode. If you work on an Android app, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to presume you do, you'll know that when your user reports a problem or a crash, it's the absolute worst feeling. To make matters worse, they might one-star your app, go on Twitter and complain about the app, and if they're feeling particularly merciless, probably go on Reddit or something and post it there. But you know what? They have absolutely every reason to. If you treat your customers basically as an offsite QA team, it's rude to them and it's just bad for business. As developers, we don't want to rely on customers to report errors. Instead, we want to catch this much early on. Ideally, you just have automated tests and these tell you when there's a problem. But, as we've talked about on the show multiple times, that's not always as easy as we want it to be. Because writing tests can be hard. That's why Sentry, our sponsor for today's show, tells you about errors in your code before your customers have a chance to encounter them. Not only do they tell you about the errors, they also give you helpful details that help you fix these errors. For example, how many users were impacted by this bug, the complete stack trace if it's a crash, the commit ID when this error was released, the engineer who wrote this line of code that was busted, that and a whole lot more. If your code is broken, let's fix it together. That's Sentry's tagline. Love it. You can check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Sentry is a pretty common word. It's actually a pretty cool name for the service if you know the English meaning of the word. But I want to make sure you get that domain name right. It's sentry.io. Once again, sentry.io/for, as in FOR/Android. Check them out today and fix your errors before your users encounter them. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Sentry.
Happy New Year, Kaushik.
Happy New Year. How's it going?
It's going well. How are you doing this year?
I am doing good. 2019 got started off with a bang.
That's right. The end of 2018 to the beginning of 2019, right?
I like that. Yeah, 2019. New Year's. Do you usually do like New Year's resolutions?
No, I'm one of those people that thinks like if I have something that I need to do, then I'm going to start it now. So I wanted to, I started getting up a little bit later, like 5 o'clock, which was late for me in the morning. And I was like, I need to get back to 4:30. And that was like probably like the 27th. I was like, I got to get back up at 4:30 again. And so I just did it, So I don't do much New Year's resolutions. What about you?
I don't necessarily do New Year's resolution, but it is definitely, I like to do the whole reflection thing. So like end of the year, I sort of like think like, how did 2018 go? Like how much of the stuff that I've wanted to do have I been doing, and how much of the stuff do I need to be doing more? And then I just try to like sort of in some ways similarly try to alter things. I don't necessarily, have a poster or something up with my New Year's resolutions as such. Because in some ways that also just seems daunting, but I try to alter my habits every day to make sure that I'm like spending the time there, like on things that I want to be doing. But I do definitely have like a reflection process, and it's like a good checkpoint in my mind to like focus and like think about the things that I want changed.
That's good though. I mean, I think it's important everyone reflect and understand what they want out of life. And I think having the new year around does give people kind of this point in time where they can say, all right, this is when I'm going to do that. So it's good. I think everyone benefits from the new year. So I wanted to talk to you today because I know that over, many months now off air, we have chatted many times about architecture and, hey, how are you doing things over at Instacart? And, what do you think about this pattern? And we always have these discussions off air, and we've always wanted to kind of have one on air. So I thought I'd kind of pose a question to you today on air about how are you doing things over where you work at Instacart? Are you using any type of architecture on your application? Are you following anything like MVP, Mvvm, MVI, or just MVRX, or anything of like your own concoction? And if so, I'd love to kind of pepper you with some questions if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. So not so recently, or maybe at this point it is like not so recently, I went to MBLT, which is like a conference, and I gave this talk around like some of the ideas as like, in its sort of like V0 version. And as you just mentioned, like over time, like in the last few months, we've been talking. And so this idea has sort of evolved. Yeah, and I'll be like more than happy to share. Again, like to be clear, this is something that I think is like an evolving sort of pattern. I hesitate to call it pattern because again, this is the other interesting thing, right? To cut the long story short, it is very similar to MVI, or like what the Android community has come to call MVI, right?
Okay.
Or like managing reactive state. Like there's a lot of like sort of like initial talks that were given some time back. And I can add like a bunch of like links to like the resources for some of the initial ideas that sort of like drove me towards thinking about like maybe coming up with something a little different. But interestingly, the aha moment for me came about when like one of the engineers that I was working with here at Instacart, right? Like basically sort of indirectly told me like, hey, this isn't necessarily like a pattern per se. It's just like a collection of like ideas or like tenets, so to speak, like, of like salient features that we want. And, we could go about it in multiple ways, but like really that's only what this is, right? And I was like, yeah, that's absolutely it, right? Because this was the problem. If you come about saying, hey, this is this new pattern, right? And if this pattern isn't necessarily too different from what you're doing anyway, then it sort of adds this layer of like cognitive complexity in between, because you're like, wait, but isn't that similar? You start to force yourself to compare it to other patterns, right? Like, oh, how is this different from MVP? How is this different from MVVM or like, MBC? And I found that itself was like, it was sort of taking away from the idea of what we were trying to implement, which is like, no, really what we care about is this specific aspect is what I care about. How you go about it doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
But then obviously what happens is if you have multiple ways to achieve the same thing, then that also leads to problems, right? So my sort of hope was like, well, this is the core objective. And so once you completely understand what the core objective is as an engineer, so that's like the fundamental like sort of idea as to what we're trying to go towards, and then also coming up with an opinion in some ways, right? And so then we're like, oh, and this is how we're choosing to sort of implement it, and the advantage with that is you're not forcing something on someone, right? Because like you're like, hey, this is the core fundamental. This is why we're doing it this way, right? And if you can come up with a better fashion, like then that's great. But if it's just an alternative to like achieving the same core fundamental, then like maybe just stick with this for like consistency. So that was like sort of the overarching idea. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think one thing that I would like to unravel a little bit here that you said is that you wanted to have some core tenets in your application that you wanted to follow. What were some of those core tenets that you wanted to follow, or like what did you feel that these things were that you needed to make sure they implemented inside of this new kind of programming model that you were implementing?
Absolutely. So what we probably might land up doing is like when we dive into this is I'll probably like spend some time talking about like the terminology or naming that at least in my mind I'm using for these features. But what I'll do, there's about like 6 sort of core tenets or like core features, like so to speak, right? Salient features for this pattern. And I can tell you what they are. Obviously, some of these use like certain terminology, and maybe then we can like segue into like talking about the terminology first and then like maybe diving into these features. Yeah.
That'd be great. Yeah.
So there are like sort of 6 features, so to speak. The first one is screens are driven by a single view model, right? And again, with these features, it's more of like the opinion, right? The opinion as to how we plan to do these things. The core fundamentals are like when we talk about the definitions, like that's when it'll sort of like make sense as to what the core fundamentals are. But with these things, I'll just like list these points out, and then obviously we can follow up with the terminology and naming.
Yeah.
So the 6 ones are like, the first one is screens are driven by a single view model. So what that basically means is like if you have an activity or like a fragment, that is dictated by a single view model. So we don't necessarily, and like obviously the takeaway from this is you don't necessarily compose multiple view models. A single screen is not composed of multiple view models, but it has like a one-to-one relationship with a view model, if that makes sense.
Yep, that's.
The second feature is screens listen to a single observable that emits a view state, which is exposed from the view model. So let me break that down. So if this screen that we have, the only thing it sort of listens to from the view model is an observable of a view state.
Okay.
Which then obviously brings the question what a view state is, but we'll get into that in a second. The next, screens listen to a single observable of view effects exposed from the view model. So the previous one was an observable of view state. This is basically an observable of view effects. Again, obviously, the distinction between view state and view effects, we'll talk about it in a second. Okay. But that's like the next core tenet, right? And the other one is events are sent into the view model through a single function. This is like we call this function process inputs, but like obviously there are like different names. But the idea here is any event that is emitted from the activity or the fragment or what we call screens is sent in through a single function into the view model.
Okay.
And the idea is basically you have, and by function I mean like a Kotlin function, so like a method. So there's like a single method that actually sees all of these events come into the view model.
Okay.
The next one is called breaking the chain. This is more like a tongue-in-cheek kind of way because like there's this famous song called breaking the chain. Never mind, there's bad pop reference, but the idea here is inside the view model, when those events have to be sent out into a view state, we don't actually link them, but we break them. We break that chain. That chain isn't like a single sort of like thing. The way to explain this better would be that function which takes in all the events does not directly expose the view state as a return type. It just takes in the events. And the two previous features that I talked, the two salient features that I talked about, which is that observable of view state and observable view effects, that connection is independent in the view model.
Okay.
That's like, and this one I know that point I know like probably needs more elaboration. And once we get to it, we can talk about it.
Little confused, but yeah, we'll get to it.
Yeah. And the final one is like basically the testing strategy, right? Like all of these, like the whole objective with this is we want to test the heck out of this thing, right? And when I say tests, I mean like we want business logic and like use cases to actually be tested to a point where we don't need instrumentation tests. Like by and large, we shouldn't need instrumentation tests to cover like a majority of these cases. Where we would need instrumentation tests is the final glue logic. And again, this is something like as we dive into this, it'll make more sense. But like that final glue logic to just make sure that your view state and screen bind in the right fashion, that's the only time we'll probably need an instrumentation test. But 85 to 90% of the time, our core business use cases should, if done right, hopefully not need those things. So that's like these are like the collection of changes, collection of like core 10.
So you said something interesting there, the testing strategy. You want to test the heck out of it, which kind of makes me, I want to even rewind it all the way back to the beginning here. It's like, when you were, what really made you come up with these tenets or these I guess not these features? Like, what was the driving factor for you to decide, hey, you know what, we need to take our app in this direction? Was there some kind of impetus that happened? Was there something that was like, you know what, we really need something that has X, Y, and Z? Was it testing? Was it just kind of getting people on board? What was, or were there multiple things?
Absolutely. Oh, that's a fantastic question, right? Like the question is like, why even do this, right? Like what's wrong with,
what's the point?
Yeah. What's wrong with MVVM, or like how we have come to understand with any of the other patterns, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So a couple of things. One thing is, despite all of the, like my trouble with MVVM as it stands today is once your app reaches a certain, well, not your app, once your feature per se, right, reaches a certain level of complexity, what we noticed is it's hard to identify problems because like, you know, you just have all kinds of like events firing from all over the place. So it's hard to like debug and sort of identify problems quickly, right? That was like one of like, for example, if we hear like of a bug and like this screen is like one of like, you know, there are some certain parts of our app that are like super complex. It's hard for us to say like, that's exactly where the problem arose. And that's what the user saw at this point of time, right? It's just really hard. And I remember one of the episodes that we had before with Hannes, you know, when he talked about MVI, that was like the real, like, you know, being able to explicitly tell like the user, this event was like, you know, spawned by the user and this is what the user saw at that point of time. You know, having that sort of trace is so important, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I feel that as your app sort of like increases in complexity is something that's typically lost. So that was like one of the core objectives. Like if I get a bug report, can I with some sort of confidence say what event got spawned and what result was seen? And obviously the idea there is like, well, clearly that happened, so which means it should be reproducible, right? So those are the set of events that we saw. Let me write a test for it. And sure enough, the hope is you would see that same result or like, you know, the sort of result that the user saw, which obviously if reported as a bug was not correct. So then you can quickly sort of like correct that, right? And like improve your test harness in that fashion, if that makes sense.
Did you find your current implementation was just hard to replicate those bugs, or are you finding that just a lot of, you know, extraneous things were happening that made things difficult to reproduce?
Absolutely.
Or what?
It's straight up like I think the existing way, at least that we used MVVM, was because as your app becomes like more complex, that view model starts to see events like from all over the place, right? For example, a good example, like say you have like a profile page, right? And you have more than one person who's triggering an update to that profile page. Like maybe the network came back, or like, you know, from your local database, you came back with a change, right? Because of an update that happened from somewhere else. It was hard to like trace that event, right? We are like, wait, what happened here? Like, I don't see exactly like what changed, but clearly like we have the screenshot of what the user saw and it's like incorrect, right? And then we're going back, we're like, oh, we saw like there was a network request, there was like a local database change. And the trouble is, well, you could add telemetry like at every single step, like, oh, this button was clicked, oh, this network request happened. But then at a certain point, like that becomes unfeasible, right? Because then you'll see like, well, I have this 20 events that happen, but like I don't necessarily know what caused the final change, right? They're like race conditions, like that sort of like was a big pain point for us. And in the talk, like there's like one of these slides where I basically took literally exactly a screen from one of the from like the apps that I'm working on, and I told them like I just went to about like 50% of like the different events that update parts of the screen, and it just goes like completely out of hand, right? Like it gets like incredibly crazy. And that's just like probably like a portion of what that screen does. Now you can obviously argue like, oh, then maybe it's like a God object or like, but the truth is like at a certain point, even if you broke that into individual classes, that still doesn't necessarily like solve the problem because, inherently the ask is complex.
Yeah. It's hard to say that there's one thing going on that's causing it. It's multiple different things that's causing it.
Have you noticed that, like, at least in the apps that you work on, like where like you have this view model and then like you notice that it just has to deal with like 20 different things being like communicated, and then it's hard to like trace like where all of it happens?
Well, yeah, I would set up these bindings in the view model. Here, a few things. I would maybe create a custom binding for a view or whatever that needed to do something special. But then this custom binding would maybe need to update a value based upon something else that happened, and that would require a custom like setter in the view model or whatever. And then when that was updated, something else would get updated, and all of a sudden I had this huge rippling effect of changes. And I'm not sure this bug that kind of came out the bottom. I'm not sure what really caused it, because now I could have, it could have been this input, could have been that input, could have been this one. Oh, but it actually only happens when we do X, Y, P, Q, S in that order.
Exactly, right.
And I found it to be very difficult to trace that back hey, this is what's causing it. And so, like you said, does that mean that it was probably architected wrong? Maybe that could be argued. Were we doing too much at once? That could be argued as well. But I found it to be difficult at times to actually keep trace of what's going on end to end.
Yeah, that's definitely a similar problem that we ran into.
So would you say that was the main goal for kind of moving over to a new type of, programming or architecture model? Or was there anything else that, that you had that you wanted to accomplish with this?
It was definitely one of the big driving points, but definitely not just the only reason. The other one was obviously writing more testable code, right? Now, obviously, this is like more of like an objective, but what does that mean? Could we not write testable code before? Like, well, we could. We just want to make it easier, The trouble with and this is something that we have talked about like quite a few times in the podcast, right? Is instrumentation tests are amazing. Espresso is amazing that it enables what it enables.
Yeah. But
it still does take time, right? Like Espresso isn't like exactly coming for free. And even like I don't have as many problems with like the performance of Espresso necessarily, because I think it actually does run pretty damn fast given what it does. My problem was like I noticed like regardless, it always added like I wanted to come up with a pattern where our engineers wouldn't think twice about adding a test. Like adding a test should be so easy where we're like, yeah, okay, there's this thing. It's just like, this is how I would write the test, right? And there has to be like it shouldn't be like you're building a new feature altogether just to write your test, right? And part of it, like there are many aspects to why this could be tricky. Like for example, your dependency injection model, or, what you're trying to achieve in that feature, like, having like the input, setting it up so that you have like different sort of like events being fired. Like a lot of those things are tricky to do.
The proper data coming from the API or that you're mocking out or whatever, all kinds of stuff.
Exactly, right? Like, screen inputs, like system inputs, like all of those things, modeling all those things is a little tricky. And obviously that's where like, that's the whole point of the test, right? Because those are the things that users typically see. Doing that in a sort of like easier way, at least at the testing layer, was for sure something that was like a nightmare. And like more often than not, I noticed that people, and I say when I notice, this includes me, right? I was like, yeah, I don't think I want to test that because it's really hard to like emulate that. Like it's not impossible, but it's just like it's another like 2x effort.
Would you say it would be like, if I were to tell you like that you wanted to implement this to help reduce friction in creating tests, would that be appropriate?
That is a perfect way to phrase that. That's exactly that's perfect phrasing.
Yeah, because it seems like you just want to, like you said before, you don't even want to have to think about it like, oh, because there is that little bit of like that tinge of like, oh man, I got to create this Espresso test. And then like, I'm afraid I'm going to get that test not found error in Espresso. You know that one I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Or like, did animations run? Or like what happened
here? You just want to throw your computer out the window. So it's, but no, like that's the big thing. If you can remove that, and I know that and one of my clients that I'm working with now, like we have a very similar thing we're kind of doing, and writing the tests to me, I run them all in the JVM, all the business logic and everything like that. And I think that's what this gets at too, is that I don't even really have to worry about that I'm going to fire up Espresso. I'm just going to be running a JUnit test, testing this logic. Am I getting these inputs correct? Are we providing the correct state, the values, etc.? And things just execute quickly, and the friction is just so low that it makes actually writing the code much more enjoyable.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, because that's the other thing, right? Because like all the product folks and
Mm-hmm.
like in the end you're building a service, right? Like that's what
Yep.
pays the bills, and you
Totally.
want to be able to do that. Like, if a product manager comes and says like, hey, I want to try like these 3 different things, I want to do these try out these different features. We
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be able to like add or like build features in a sort of scalable and safe way. As
Mm-hmm.
an engineer, I should never like think twice about adding a new feature. I was like, I don't really want to touch that part of like the app because like it's like super complex.
Yeah.
It could be come up with something that just like sort of makes that process easy. So that was like the final objective. And again, like this, there's like no holy grail per se. I don't like necessarily say, oh, this like is star spangling shiny, like this solves all problems in the universe for like development. It absolutely, there's obviously shortcomings. There are certain shortcomings, but by and large, I feel like this is a very good, at least personally, I felt this is a very good evolution of how we have started to build our features. If that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And you said something that was important there at the end, that you have, you want to make it easier for folks to add something to a feature or extend it or change it or anything like that. And so reducing the test friction, making it easier to implement, making things easier to reproduce, all those fall in line with that. The one thing that I'm wondering how you've handled it and maybe your experience around this is from how, and this goes back to the core tenets and salient features. You have these 6 here, and some of them are like, you listen to a single observable, view effects, view state, events are sent through a single model, all this kind of stuff. How have you found this to impact maybe junior developers or folks that are new to your team? Has it been difficult to get them up and running?
So that's the thing. The short answer is like definitely. When you throw this at someone, they're like, "What just happened?"
Yeah.
For sure. But I think that's also like one thing, which is why it took so long. I feel in my mind was part of the process is like getting this like early on, right? Like having simple examples demonstrating like how this sort of works. Or like taking an existing feature and saying, this is how we have it done this way, but this is how, like in this new world, this is how I would like to sort of have it done. As part of that process, like and like probably and in all likelihood through a series of blog posts, through Instacart, I'll be like releasing this in our tech blog. But by and large, I think the biggest sort of way to help communicate this was 2 things. One is we had like people early on in the process, right? Like I like talk about it in like a way where like we like first just give like an impression of what this is, like an overall idea. But in the end, the most powerful way, at least for developers, was like, especially for like relatively junior developers who in the end aren't necessarily impressioned, right? Like if that makes sense. Like if you remember like the early days when we started out, we didn't necessarily have too strong opinions. We just knew of a way to do it, right? So if you've only done it one way, it's hard to compare why this is any better or worse than the others, right? So it's like merely just understanding that. What I found is they're having examples of like common use cases. For example, like, how does rendering a list in this world work? Like, like how does, if I have to like display an alert dialog or something, how does that work, right? If I have like a search box input, how does that work? Like, how do like events get sent into the view model? Like breaking those as like explicit examples was greatly beneficial. I have like this, I'll post a link to this. Like I created this very basic app called a movies search application in modeled in this fashion. And all it does is just basically like you can search for movies, like, it shows results. You click the result, it adds it to a history list. You add it to the history list, it restores it back with information. So it's sort of mildly contrived, but not terribly simple. It's not as simple as a Hello World app, but it is enough where it shows you like the most common sort of like interactions that you would have in, a typical application. The examples are super helpful. Like that in the end, because that's once people start to understand layers of what you're trying to explain, like the natural questions like, oh, how do I do that, right? And having an explicit example saying like, look at this is how we do it, just immediately makes it click. So that's typically how, the naming aspect was like probably really tricky because, naming is hard, and like I don't necessarily think I've come up with like good names, especially since the names I think would be appropriate are names that have connotations already in the existing world, right? So that was also part of like the trouble. Like when I approached it in my mind, I knew this is basically how I want it to be. But the trouble is like coming up with a good name. I didn't care about the name, but in the end, names do matter. So being able to come up with a name that is sort of a good trade-off between like not having a collision with what people already know, but also like serving the sort of like concept was kind of tricky. But maybe that's something we can get into.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue to talk about some of that terminology that we were discussing inside the salient features. You know, we had brought up things like view state, view effects, breaking the chain, stuff like that. Would that be, appropriate to talk about that now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so one of the things that I initially heard, and I think this was with like number 2, screens listen to a single observable that emits a single view state, was the word view state. Now, I'm not even sure if that's the right place to start, but to me, the word view state sticks out because we really don't have anything like that that's already in our vernacular as Android developers. Would you mind explaining that? And if that's not the right place, kind of redirect me?
Oh, no, perfect. That's like a great starting place. So like maybe that's like, I think step 1 is like just explaining what these terms stand for, right? So view state, like you're right. This is something that's probably not used already in the existing Android vernacular. View state is essentially just a data class object that represents like what the user sees. Like it is, so maybe an example would make sense, right? So I have like dashboard view state, and dashboard view state is the view state object for my dashboard activity, right? So if I have an activity called dashboard, the view state in that would basically be dashboard title, dashboard, card count, dashboard spinner showing, dashboard error message. Like those are basically the fields. And I think the idea is if I read the fields in that view state object, I should have a good understanding of what is presented in that screen. Does that?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah,
exactly. It's just the things that I'm going to see on the screen. So it's, the state of the screen.
Yeah. And it's literally the final output. It isn't necessarily like the object or the entity. It isn't like, the user object or something. It has to literally be even like a level lower, which is user name or like, or like toolbar title or, header subtitle or something along those lines. It basically represents exactly what the user sees, like at the final state.
Should there be anything in there that's not used, or should that be only the stuff that's on the screen?
So the idea, it should actually only be stuff that you see on the screen.
Okay.
At least that's currently like how we're thinking.
But like I wouldn't throw let's say I have toolbar title, I have button title, but then like I need a few things from the user object. And so I'm being kind of lazy and I'm like, I'm just going to throw the whole user object in there. Should I do that? Or is that like not what you would do?
Well, that's a good question, right? Like, and even in my example, there's like one of those places I do it, but I was actually being lazy there. Ideally, you shouldn't have to do it because that state is coming from somewhere else. Like this is literally just it is only what the user sees, right? Everything else should be stored somewhere else. It shouldn't necessarily be sent back. But again, like this is an evolving thing, right?
Okay.
You can always make the case. And again, another big point, like I wanted to like stress with this whole thing was like these are like strong opinions, but that doesn't necessarily mean you cannot not do it this way. Because again, this is like new and evolving. Like it's hard to say like this will be like the perfect way to get it. So as it stands, like the view state is typically only it's only the visual information that's presented.
Okay. All right. And then it looks like the next one that we had here was view effects. Is that related to view state, or what is view effects in general?
Yeah. So view effect. So here's the thing, right? Quickly, a question that came up when initially I came up with this view state, sort of like a concept of just emitting a view state, is like, what happens to cases where you have a toast message that needs to be seen, or navigation that has to happen, or an alert dialog that needs to be like displayed or something? Because typically what happens is sometimes when you have user inputs, you have like a toast message pop up or something, right? The trouble is, sure, you can have this in the view state, but if you encode it in the view state, what happens is this view state persists, right? So that so if say I have like a screen rotation or something, right? Like, like a configuration change occurs, that view state is going to be sent back, right? Like you want that view state actually to be remembered, because when the user sees the screen again, you're not going to like restart all these events and then come. I mean, you could, but if you want to maybe persist some of that work that's done in the background, you're basically, all you're going to do is just show the existing view state that you have already, right? The trouble is if you have like, show toast message or something in there, every time you pop up the screen, you're going to have the toast message pop up again, right? And this may not necessarily be what you want.
Oh, I gotcha.
And the other easy example to think about is like navigation, right? Like say you click a button and you navigate to another screen. If you encode that in the view state saying like navigate to screen A, what's going to happen is you'll navigate to screen A, but after you finish screen A, when you come back, you'll need a way to clear that view state. If you don't clear that view state, what will happen is again, you'll just like end back in a loop where you again like get like pushed to the screen A, right? Now, there are multiple ways to handle this. Again, like this, initially in the early days, the thought process was like, oh, maybe you can have like an interval or something, like in RX, you can have an interval that after you perform this action, you clear it. So it resets. You'll need some notion of like resetting the state, right? And that initially worked, but then it was just getting very confusing, right? And so then one of like the other engineers like said, like, what if we had like an independent sort of object that told us this, which is actually why then like conceptually, and I mean, I can show like some of the PRs that I had as it evolved. So initially I only had the view state. Then the next process was basically, I actually had an object called view change, right? A view change is equal to a view state plus a list of this other one-time view effects.
Okay.
And view change is just like, initially actually it was an explicit data class object, right? That I started off. That was like my sort of V2. But eventually what I realized is like, actually that just adds more layers of complexity and we didn't need to do it that way. So instead now I only have view state and view effects. I just like for conceptually, we call those view changes just because, it's easy to like sort of refer to it. Like when you want to conceptually refer to like both of these things together, we call that as a view change. But really a view state is what the user sees, and view effects are like one-time sort of effects almost, right? Like it's like, I don't want this to persist in the UI, but it's something that I want to happen intermittently, like in the UI, if that makes sense.
Can you give me an example of that? Like a real world example of when I would have something in view effects or what?
Absolutely. So navigation, and again, like the toast thing, right, is like a view effect. So say I think in my movies sort of repository, the example that I used is, so the way this movie examples works is you type for a movie title, you hit search, there's a network request, it presents a result, right? When you click the result, it gets added to a history, it gets added to a movie history list in the bottom. But when you tap it, I also want to pop up a toast message saying added to history. Right?
Okay.
Because the idea is if you keep repeatedly tapping, I don't want to keep adding it to the history. I only add it to the history once. So what like again, this is like a contrived product feature, right? This is not to say like this is how it should work. It's just I wanted something to demonstrate the idea that if it's added to the history, I want a toast message to pop up. And if you keep clicking it again, it has the animation, but it won't pop up the toast message because it's already added to the history once, right? So one way to do it is, so if you see it, basically, I think it is added. Let me actually pull up the example. So I want to make sure I'm referring to the right object in my example. And again, like we can post, we'll definitely post a link to like all this, like all the exact code that I'm using and I'm talking about, so it's easier for folks to understand. But basically, added to history toast effect is the name of the class that I use. That's like an example of, because like when it gets added to the history, like I add a single view effect.
And then you have you're watching that observable of view effects, and then at that point, that of course something is emitted to it, and then since you're subscribing to it, then you show something on the screen, and that's when maybe your toast would show, correct?
Exactly, and that's like part of the thing. So and this is also like where like the other features come into the picture, because your activity or your screen is listening to the view model. Like it actually listens to the view state independently, and it listens to the view effects independently. So both of these are observables, and you're basically subscribing to these independently.
Okay.
Which is also what I meant by, we can get to it, but that's basically what I meant by breaking the chain in some ways. But the idea here is the view state is persisted. So you can send the view state, and that's like literally what we want to be persisted. It's the list of view changes that we want persisted, while view effects are basically one-time changes that you want to have. Again, this could be UI related, like a toast, but the other like common example is if I want navigation to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say I want to like navigate to screen B. What I would do then is maybe have like a navigate to screen A effect or something, or navigate to screen B effect. And so that way, when an event comes in and based on like a certain set of actions that happened, I can send in a single navigation effect. And because you're listening to this independently, you'll navigate to that screen. And when you come back, that effect is drained. So like it doesn't sort of re-navigate because it's listening independently, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it does kind of, you have to get a solid look at the code to get a firm understanding, but I have a conceptual understanding of it.
Yeah, and I mean, if folks go back and like look at the added to toast history effect, it'll become clear like what I mean by that. It's essentially the idea with needing a view state and a view effect is because I don't want to encode one-time sort of changes into the view state, because I don't want to persist those.
Makes sense. No, it does make sense because you don't want to persist them, like you said.
Yeah.
Now, you said another piece of terminology here that I think it's important to kind of illustrate, and that's, you keep saying the word screens. What do you mean by the word screens? So
screens is just like a convenient way for me to refer to activities, fragments, views, all as like as a common concept, right? Now, again, this is where we can get into like bigger debates, because the next obvious question that comes up is like, well, do you have a single activity? Do you have like multiple fragments? Do you have custom views? Like, how does that work, right? The interesting aspect of this pattern is like you can actually implement it at all of these levels, right? So you could have an activity driven by two fragments, and you can have two view models like for these fragments and have them sort of like work in the same way, right? You can have maybe a single activity, but with like a bunch of custom views, or like, and each view could be driven by a view model in itself,
Okay.
There's different ways to handle this. So initially when I started out, I didn't want to, like, that is, again, like we do have an opinion with like on how we should be doing that, at least inside the app, but that's not necessarily something that I wanted to sort of conflate with this set of core tenets, right?
Okay.
So I wanted a common way to refer to these things. So it's only a conceptual thing. So I only, like, when I say screen, it's like the conceptual sort of a grouping of activities, fragments, or custom views. In our actual code, we still have activities, we still have fragments, we still have views, and they're called those things, right? So if I have like my dashboard activity, I would have a corresponding dashboard activity view model, if that makes sense. I don't actually call these screens in code, but when I want to refer to these things, I just refer to them as screens, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I think you also said something there that was interesting. You said you have a view model. Now, is that like an actual view model for like the Android view model, or is it something else you've created, or what? Or do you call them something?
It's straight up like the Google architecture, like components view model, right? Like that's the view model we are using. Now, this pattern doesn't necessarily mean you have to use the Google architecture components, but that's where like more it's like an opinion. Like the view model that Google has given us with the architecture components is just incredibly powerful in some ways, especially to handle the Android sort of like nuances. So we, at least like, in like the app that I work for at Instacart, we definitely use the Google architecture components view model, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And in some cases, maybe we may not, right? Like with the custom views, sometimes you wouldn't necessarily need to use like the Google architecture components, but we use view models as that sort of representation. Does that make sense? Like,
no, it does make sense. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were using that or your own custom things. So sometimes that word gets overloaded a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And we use it in the same way that Google basically wants us to use view models, if that makes sense.
Okay, makes sense.
It exists in that same dimension.
Okay. So other question I have here is like, I know we got this view state thing, we have view effects, we got this view model, but what happens when like a user interacts with the screen? How are you modeling that type of stuff? You know, I click a button, maybe I enter some text. You want to know when the text has been changed. Anything in those type of events, maybe they're called events. I don't know. What do you kind of reference that as inside of your model here?
Oh, 100%. And so this is where like we actually get into like the nuts and bolts of what might be a little different from like the MVVM world or like in other aspects, right? So the idea is any input that goes into the view model is sent in through an event object. And we use Kotlin seal classes here so that they all respect like a single sort of event, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And literally everything's modeled as an event, right? Like, so if there's a button tap, that's modeled as an event. Even the screen load, like for example, the very first time you load an activity or a fragment, that's modeled as an event, because sometimes, you know what, like you have to kickstart like a network call and like populate it with results. So we have a screen load event, you know, that pops up. Sometimes you want to do something different, like on resume, right? Like, so then we have like screen resumed event or something. Everything is modeled. So it's not just UI interactions that's sent as events. It's literally anything that could potentially cause your state to change.
Okay.
That's sent in as an event. So sometimes we might have like polling sort of events that happen, right? Like for example, on this screen, we have like a polling thing that happens constantly. Those are modeled as events. You know, you might have like a deep link or something coming from outside, then that's modeled as like an event, and that's sent into the view model. So anything that potentially changes your state is modeled as an event and sent into the view model.
Now, I remember from a previous conversation that we had around this very similar thing, events, I think you had told me that your events are then processed into something called results. Is that still the case?
Right. So this is like where, so these events then, these events get transformed into what are called like results. Now, again, I'm skipping a step because like if I really want to be pedantic, these events are changed into actions and actions are changed into results. But let's not complicate things with the actions just yet, right? 90% of the time, it's events get transformed into results. And you're absolutely right. Because the idea here is like when you have like these events are like more or less specific to that screen, right? Like that activity or that fragment. Like if, in all likelihood, these events are like only going to be pertinent to that specific screen. But what would happen in the background is like those events would potentially like cause things that are like reusable, right? Like for example, if I have to like get my user object or something, right, or refresh my user object, that's going to spawn a network request, right? So those are things that are potentially reusable. So that event needs to like hit this common thing that we do, and we provide results, right? That result object is like the intermediate layer where it's almost like that is where you potentially will get model data, right? So for example, doing this user sort of like refresh, this user like query. Actually, let me do this, like, because we have the movies sort of like example, like in code, let me use that as like a reference for these examples, right? So one of the things you do is you search for a movie, right? So you search, there's a search movie event, and in that object, you basically send the title. Now, this gets sent into the view model, and inside the view model, I basically hit the OMDB. OMDB is like this this free movies API where you can like it hits like Rotten Tomatoes, it hits IMDb, it hits a bunch of like these movie repositories, and it gives you like data, right? So I have to make this request to this OMDB API, right? So I transform that event into like this network request that gets sent, and it gives me a result in quotes, right? Now it actually gives me an LCE of like results, but we can step into that like in a second. But does that make sense so far? Like, so this result object would contain like the movie object, you know, because I sent in a search title, and the network, like the API, the backend API gives me essentially this object, this result object, and I model that as a result. And this is where the reusable portion comes in, because I could potentially search for a movie like in a whole bunch of other places in my app, but they all would have like, you know, like this result come in. So that is basically what a result is. So, Do you want to talk about the LCE of result thing?
That was actually my next exact question of like, what is an LCE? Now, I personally know because I've read about it and we've talked about it before, but I know listeners are probably listening like, LCE, what the heck is that?
Right. So LCE is basically just loading content error, right? One of my colleagues, Lymanus, like he's written a blog post about this, and I can make sure I add a link to that as well. But this is like not necessarily something that's like unique. I think Google in their samples repository now starts to call these things as like resources. We just call it LCE because it's sort of like this unique abbreviation that means nothing, but then it's also easy because there's no collision, right? So LCE stands for loading content error. And this
I prefer LCE over resource.
because like resource is like, again, like it is more meaningful, but it's like more common, right? Which then adds more sort of ambiguity to what it means, which is why like, yeah, we definitely like the name LCE. And the idea is basically to model network results, right? So with this, when I mentioned this movie search thing, so it gets sent down as an LCE of a result. And why this happens is obviously because it's a network request, so it could take time. So the minute that event is sent in, the first thing that we send is like a loading, and LCE is basically like, again, a sealed class, right? So you can have like loading content error, and then it has a subtype. Again, I can point to, this is something that's just so much more easier explained in code. So I'll make sure I drop a link to that. But the idea is you would get an LCE of a movie result, and you start off like in RX, you start off by saying like, you send in a loading movie result, and that basically gets transformed into a Viewstate object. And in that Viewstate object, I basically say spinner is basically showing, right? Because right now I'm still in my loading result. The minute the content comes in, I change the Viewstate to like reflect that. So like my spinner should go back to like hidden, my movie title should show this, the image should show this, and like, those get transformed. And if I get an error result object, then basically there are like different, like, and this is where like sometimes maybe I might want to show like a one-time view effect saying error movie not found as a one-time thing. Or if I feel like it's something I want to be displayed permanently, then I just encode that in the Viewstate.
No, that makes sense then, because I really like the concept of an LCE, because to me, it just makes sense. You're loading, you have content, or you have error, and it's just pretty simple pattern to follow,
Yeah. So that basically is how it stands with events getting transformed into an LCE of result. And then, like I mentioned, the LCE of like the result is transformed into the Viewstate. And this is actually like if for folks who have been like looking at like Jake Wharton has this amazing talk called like Managing Reactive State, and like that along with Hannes's like MBI, along with some of these other concepts that folk like and our good friend Gabriel, like with MBA, like Mavericks, like a lot of these ideas. I know Spotify has like maybe something called Mobius, which is like also very like similar. A lot of these things I've sort of derived from those, and the result that gets the LCE of like they call this like the reducing process, right? Like, so in functional programming, when you think about like reducers, this is where like the reduction happens, if that makes sense. Again, like I don't want to dive into those details just yet, and like if folks have questions, they can follow up on that. And like the code usually like points towards what's happening. But again, like stepping back, like one of the things I also wanted is because we have a range of developers in any company, right? We have folks who are new to these concepts. We have folks who have done these before. I didn't want to necessarily complicate things by bringing in specific terminology. So that's all specific terminology to functional programming, that is. Which is why basically I was like trying to model these things and saying, oh, this is what happens. Like you have screens, you have events, you have like the view model, and that sends like results, and then you have like Viewstate and ViewFX, right? Does that, I know this is like a lot, like I just like sort of like blurted out. So maybe one thing we can do is if folks have follow-up questions so far, like we're going to probably like in another episode, we're going to follow up and like dive into like the salient features of the core tenants. But in the meantime, if folks have like questions, I'd be more than happy to like take them. And like if folks have questions for us, like maybe they should send it in like they should post it in the like the Discord channel. And like we can also have like in the follow-up episode, we can make sure that we answer some of these questions, because again, I understand like you and I have been talking about this like for quite some time. So like I'm pretty sure there's like a shared understanding that we already had that folks might be like, hey, wait a second, like, I didn't quite catch what you mean by that. So I'm more than happy to like answer those questions if folks have them.
Yeah, the link if you're not part of the Discord chat group, you can go to fragmentedpodcast.com, and in the menu you'll see Fragmented Chat. Click that. It has the link to join the chat server, and then you can chat via the mobile app or desktop app or whatever. There's a channel in there called Fragmented Podcast. That's probably the best place to drop the questions, and we'll just check that channel prior to recording the next episode. And like you said, these different salient features such as the screens are driven by a single view model. We'll start diving into each one of those with kind of the why, maybe some questions and caveats I have about it, and listener questions that maybe have popped up as well, and then kind of allow folks to really wrap their head around it. And Kaushik, if folks want to take a look at the sample app, where can they find that thing so they can just kind of start playing around with it or see what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So I'll post a link to this in the show notes, but it's basically in my GitHub repository. So my GitHub handle is Kaushik Gopal, and movies-USF. USF basically stood for unidirectional state flow, which is, in the end, this is really one of the core tenets. Like, we want to be able to manage state in like, a safe manner, which is, that's some inside baseball as to why I called it USF. So yeah, movies-USF is the name of the repository. I'll make sure to post that in the show notes as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, Kaushik, I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through everything that you're doing over at Instacart. I know I share a lot of the similar features in some of my client apps that I've been working on recently. So it's going to be fun kind of exploring this in more detail in the coming episodes.
Absolutely. And if folks want to like maybe ping you and ask you for like certain questions, because I know like you've done a lot of this stuff as well before, and I know like you definitely have like ideas and like you have approaches. If folks want to find out more about that, where should they hit you up?
The easiest and best place is always going to be Twitter. The limiting factor being 280 characters means I can reply to you pretty quickly and not write you a book. So there, or you can also check me out on Instagram at Don Felker. What about you, Kaushik? If folks want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do it?
I try to reserve Kaushik Gopal everywhere I go. So it's Kaushik Gopal on Twitter, and it's also Kaushik Gopal on Instagram, which is where you want to see if you want to catch up with the other stuff that I do.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening. We will catch you in the next episode. I want to thank Sentry for sponsoring today's show. Their tagline is, "Your code is broken, let's fix it together." They're a super cool crash reporting service that gives you all the helpful details that you need when detecting and fixing errors in your application. Don't wait for your users to report your errors and crashes. Use Sentry to catch them earlier. Check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Once again, because Sentry is a common word, I want to make sure you get it right. Sentry.io. My thanks to Sentry for sponsoring today's show. And before we wind this show down, I also want to thank Nevercode for sponsoring the show. Specifically, their brand new cloud-based CI/CD tool called CodeMagic. They partnered with Google and released the very first CI/CD tool exclusively for building Flutter apps. Build, test, and publish your Flutter apps in record time with CodeMagic. Check them out at codemagic.io while the service is still available to everyone for free. My thanks to Nevercode again for sponsoring the show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.